to recognize fruits. Thus, building brain-based devices, as Dr. Edelman said, that are situated in the real world, engaging in behavioral tasks, controlled by a simulated nervous system and whose behavior is modified by rewards, seems to be within our reach. Perhaps, as Mr. Hawkins concluded, cognitive computing will happen any moment now. Many of these themes were taken up by our panel, who added some special insights of their own, from Dr. Alba's crusade for the decade of the mind to Dr. Berger's exciting work on spare parts for the brain. Dr. Bohan talked about the efficiency of the brain and why building a brain-like computer might make sense, while Dr. Linsker discussed organizing principles of brain function. Dr. Swartz stressed the multidisciplinary collaboration needed to handle multi-scale models of multi-level processing. There were a lot of ideas to digest in that panel and way too little time. Finally, our dinner speaker, Dr. Ramachandran, brought us back full cycle to the beginning of the day. He spoke about phantom limbs, synesthesia, and the origins of language, but the connecting link there was the mapping of function onto the brain and the hypothesis that function placement may give rise to some of our behavior and, in fact, even to analogy. I say he brought us back to the beginning as Dr. Edelman opened and closed his talk with a pair of very rich analogies in the form of poems. He also described for us the separation of mind and brain with the onset of dualism and how they were being brought back together by modern cognitive science. To my mind, nobody's listening. Okay, sorry. Dr. Ramachandran's work is helping to do exactly that. The following quotation seems like an appropriate way to conclude this reflection. O nature and O soul of man, how far beyond all utterance are your linked analogies. Not the smallest atom stirs or lives on matter, but has its cunning duplicate in mind. That, believe it or not, comes from Herman Melville, who wrote that as part of Moby Dick. So Dharmendra managed to thank just about everybody we should thank in going through here before we start the day. But I would like to say a special thank you to Dharmendra himself. As you probably all know, it was Dharmendra's idea to make cognitive computing the theme for this year's institute, and he has driven all the technical planning and obtained this amazing group of speakers for us. So thank you. Speaking of speakers, time to get on to the second day. It is a great honor for me to introduce Dr. John Searle. Dr. Searle has been a professor at the University of California, Berkeley since 1959, a point in time at which I was barely beginning to cogitate. He is noted for his contributions to the philosophy of language, philosophy of mind and consciousness, on the characteristics of socially constructed versus physical realities, and on practical reason. He is well known for his development of a thought experiment called the Chinese room argument, which argues that computers do not have to understand language in order to process information. He has written over 16 books, which have been translated into 21 languages. Recent books include Rationality in Action, Mind, and Liberté et Neurobiologie, which, in case you can't parse my French, I think means liberty and neurobiology. Many books have been written on his work, and not to mention term papers. My son just finished one, and several conferences have been devoted to his opus. Dr. Searle has received a number of honorary degrees and numerous prizes and awards, including the National Humanities Medal from the United States, of course, the Jovellanos Prize from Spain, the Jean Nicot Prize from France, a Distinguished Teaching Award from the University of California at Berkeley, the Homer Smith Award from the NYU School of Medicine, 2 Fulbrights. He was the Reith Lecturer for the BBC in London, and he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a past Guggenheim Fellow. It is with great pleasure that I get off stage and introduce you to Dr. Ronald Searle. Thank you.
I've just been promoted. Ronald Searle is much more famous than I am. But in any case, I'm very grateful for that generous introduction. I am going to talk about turning off these dreadful machines. I'm going to talk about consciousness, and I want to begin by telling you that there are, fortunately, some, unfortunately not very many, but there are some philosophical problems that can receive a scientific solution. What happened, as you all know, was this. In the 17th century, we started to figure out systematic ways of investigating nature. And it was tempting to think, well, with the growth of science, we might solve all of our problems. That, I fear, is a vain hope. But some long-standing philosophical problems, such as the nature of life, have been, I think, pretty much decisively resolved. Not the origin of life, but the nature of life. We're still puzzled about the origin. And I think something like that, at least I hope something like that, will happen with the traditional mind-body problem, the problem about the relationship between mental phenomena in general, consciousness in particular, and the physical world, specifically the brain. And we narrow this down for the purposes of today's discussion to the problems about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. Now, when I first got into this field 20 years or so ago, the prevailing orthodoxy was some version of what was then thought of as materialism, and it was the traditional reductionist kind of materialism that we were going to get rid of consciousness and mental states by showing they were really something else. And I don't have to remind this audience that the prevailing orthodoxy was that we were going to show that the brain is just a digital computer and the mind is a computer program, or perhaps a bunch of computer programs implemented in the hardware of the brain. A lot of good things have happened since then, but one of the best things, I think, was revealed by yesterday's sessions, and that is we now in cognitive science respect the brain. The details of how it works in the plumbing are well worth investigating. Again, 20 years ago, the prevailing mood at cognitive science conferences was, why do you care about the brain? The brain just happens to be the hardware in which we're implemented. But any old hardware will do. And in fact, there are famous people who've argued with growing technology, we'll all get ourselves downloaded, or perhaps it's uploaded, onto better hardware. I reviewed a book in the New York Review of Books that said within the next 10 years we will all be able to put ourselves onto hard disks. And it's true, there's not much fun being a desktop or even a laptop, but nanotechnology will come to the rescue. And I won't spell out all the details, but I am very pleased by the idea people actually respect the details of how it works in the plumbing. Okay, but now, so far so good, we're making real progress. But now something has happened which I did not foresee. In fact, in my wildest nightmares, I never thought this would happen. Dualism is becoming respectable again. If we can't get rid of consciousness, then it looks like, my God, we're back in bed with Descartes. We're back where we become dualists again. And if there's a theme that's running through this talk, it is we've got to reject both dualism and materialism as they were traditionally conceived. Now, both were trying to say something true. And at the end of the talk, I hope to be able to say, well, what was true in each and what was false in each. Okay, well, let's move forward to try to zero in on the problem of consciousness and how we might get a scientific resolution of it and what sorts of mistakes we should try to avoid. And at the beginning, we have to at least give some kind of a definition of consciousness. Now, it won't be the kind of fancy scientific definition that comes at the end of the investigation, but it will be the kind of definition that at least tells us what we're talking about. What is the target of the investigation? What is it that we're trying to explain? Thanks a lot. And I think it's often said consciousness is very hard to define. I don't think it is. I think it's rather easy to give a common sense definition. Here goes. Consciousness consists of those states of feeling or sentience or awareness that begin in the morning when you wake up from a dreamless sleep. They go on all day until you fall asleep again, or go into a coma, or die, or otherwise become unconscious. Now, on this definition, Dreams are a form of consciousness, though they're rather different from normal waking consciousness. But notice also the definition does not imply anything about behavior, and it does not imply anything about self-consciousness. You can be conscious without being self-conscious. Now, if that's our definition, then what are some of the facts that we want our theory? What are some of the features of consciousness, and what are some of the facts about consciousness that we want our theory to explain? Well, as I've defined it, it seems to me consciousness has four defining features. There are others that we could list, but we don't have an awful lot of time, so let me state what I think are the central four. First of all conscious states have a certain qualitative feel. Drinking beer just feels different from listening to late Beethoven, and eating a good meal is different from falling off a cliff. I mean, for every conscious state you have, there's a certain kind of qualitative feel to that state. And unfortunately, some people introduce the word qualia here, suggesting that some conscious states are qualitative and others not. But for me, for my money, all conscious states are qualitative. So qualia is not a useful term because all consciousness is qualia. Now, that feature itself leads to the second feature. All conscious states are subjective. They exist only insofar as they are experienced by a human or animal subject. Now, I can't tell you how much trouble this has caused in cognitive science and even in brain science, because a lot of people have the following fallacious syllogism. Science is by definition objective. Consciousness is by definition subjective. Therefore, there can be no science of consciousness. That is a fallacious inference based, it's got a name, it's called the fallacy of ambiguity, and there's an ambiguity in the objective-subjective distinction. Science does indeed aim for epistemic objectivity, in that we seek truths that do not depend on the feelings and attitudes of particular investigators. So, in addition, though, to this epistemic distinction between subjectivity and objectivity, between the statement, Rembrandt was born in 1606 and Rembrandt was a better painter than Rubens, the first of those is epistemically objective, because you can find out as a matter of fact. The second is a matter of opinion. I happen to think it's true, but a lot of people would differ from me on that. But in addition to that distinction, between the epistemic sense of objectivity and subjectivity, there is an ontological sense. Some entities that exist in the real world have a subjective mode of existence. Pains and tickles and itches and all of your thoughts and feelings have ontological subjectivity. In that respect, they differ from most features of the world, like mountains and molecules and tectonic plates, that have ontological objectivity. Now, the bottom line of this part of the discussion is the fact that a domain contains entities that are ontologically subjective, like pains and tickles and itches, does not show that there cannot be an epistemically objective science of that domain. Epistemic objectivity does not preclude ontological subjectivity. Okay, that's our second feature then of consciousness. In addition to qualitativeness and subjectivity, we need to add a third, and this I think is more important than most people recognize. All of our conscious states come to us as part of a unified conscious field. So I don't just hear the sound of my voice and feel the shirt on my neck and taste the water as I drink it, but I have all of these as part of a single, large, unified conscious field. Kant, with his usual gift for catchy phrases, called this the transcendental unity of apperception. And it's got different versions in contemporary science, but it's one way of putting the binding problem. There's more than one binding problem, but one binding problem is how on earth does the brain create this unified conscious field? Now, a fourth feature of consciousness, and maybe this is the most important, but I won't have time to say much about it, and that is intentionality. Our conscious states represent objects and states of affairs, both the real ones, imagined ones, and the possible ones, as when, for example, we decide to do something, we form an intention about the future. Intentionality, as philosophers use the term, is not restricted to just intending in the ordinary sense, but includes hope and fear and lust and shame and disgust and belief and desire, any mental state that is about something. Intentionality is another name for aboutness. And you will recognize, of course, that when we talk about information in cognitive science, it's largely what we're talking about is intentionality. Okay, now I want to mention, now those are 4 features. Now I want to mention some facts. Why? Well, in any investigation, you want to know what you're trying to explain. We need to know what are the data that we're trying to account for. Now maybe we'll have to give up on some of these putative facts, but at least we ought to know what we start from. What is it that we're seeking to explain with our theory of consciousness? And these, I want to give 4 absolutely basic points that it seems to me our theory has to explain. First of all, consciousness is real. It cannot be reduced or eliminated in favor of something else. Now, why not? I mean, we got lots of good reductions in science. I mean, we can reduce the water in this thing to H2O molecules, and we can eliminate rainbows and sunsets by showing they're an illusion. Why can't we do a reduction on consciousness? Well, we can't do an eliminative reduction because the eliminative reduction rests on the appearance, on the distinction between appearance and reality. It looks like there's an arch in the sky. It looks like the sun is setting over Mount Tamalpais, but both of those are illusions. But here's what's fascinating about consciousness. You can't make the illusion reality distinction for consciousness, not for the very existence of consciousness, because if I consciously have the illusion that I am conscious, then I am conscious. That is, consciousness is the illusion, but the illusion is the reality in the case of consciousness. Well, why can't we do a standard scientific reduction and show that consciousness is really composed of something else in the way that we can show that water is composed of H2O molecules? Well, the difficulty with that is that if we try to do a standard reduction, of a compositional reduction, we'd leave out this first-person qualitative character, because most of reality, what we might want to reduce conscious to, neuron firings, for example, have a third-person or ontologically objective mode of existence, and consciousness has a first-person or ontologically subjective mode of existence, and you can't do the standard reductions without leaving that out. Okay, so that's the first point about consciousness. You can't get rid of it. It's here to stay. Now, the second thing is this. All of our conscious states are caused by neuronal processes in the brain. I'm not going to argue that point in front of this audience because I don't think I'll have any disagreement about it. But it's worth reminding ourselves what a stunning fact that is. Everything that you experience, I mentioned some earlier, the taste of the beer, or the sound of the music, or the sight of the sky, or pick your favorite, feeling the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism. Whatever's your favorite conscious state, all of that is caused by lower-level neuronal firings in the brain. But that then leads to the next question, and this is the third thing we need to explain. Where is it? Where and how does it hang out? And here it seems to me we now know enough to be able to state with confidence, consciousness is realized in the brain. It exists in the brain as a higher level or system feature. You can't find a single neuron and say this one is conscious any more than you can find a single water molecule and say this one is liquid or this one is wet. But at a higher level than that of individual neurons, there's no question that the system is in a conscious state. So consciousness is a higher level feature of brain systems caused by the behavior of the lower level elements. Now, the fourth feature that I think we should be able to explain, and this is going to be crucial for our discussion of dualism, is consciousness functions causally. It functions causally in producing our behavior. Now, there's always some philosopher who will tell you, well, consciousness can't function causally. It's too airy-fairy. It doesn't weigh anything. It's just got to be epiphenomenal. Whenever I hear that, I want to point out the following simple experiment. I decide to raise my arm, and the damn thing goes up. I mean, that is a stunning fact. And notice we don't say, well, that's the thing about the old arm. Some days she goes up, and some days she doesn't go up. No. It's entirely up to me. It's not like the weather in April in Berkeley. It's up to me whether or not that damn arm goes up, and it's a condition of adequacy on any theory that it ought to be able to explain that. Okay, now we have had a whole lot of attempts to deal with these and other issues, and I can't resist saying a little bit about some of the problems that computationalism had. Now, I want you to notice a consequence of what I've said so far. The notion of reduction is ambiguous, because what I've said is consciousness is not reducible to any third-person phenomenon, but I also told you consciousness is entirely caused by the behavior of lower-level neuronal elements. But what that means is that consciousness is ontologically irreducible, but causally reducible. There aren't any causal powers to consciousness in addition to the causal powers of the lower-level neuronal structures. And that's not a mystery to us. That's true of most systems, any system that has higher and lower levels of description. So when I explain the behavior of my car, I talk about pistons and cylinders and explosions and gasoline, but of course all of that has to be grounded in the microstructure. In the same way, I talk about the causal powers of consciousness, but that is grounded in the microstructure. In this case, we assume it's in the neuronal structure. All right, now why did computationalism fail? Well, essentially because it failed to respect these facts. The most naive version of computationalism, what I used to call strong artificial intelligence, said that all there is to having mental states in general and consciousness in particular is running the right computer program in the brain. But the definition then used of a computer program was standard Turing account of a computer program, that the operations of the program are defined purely formally or symbolically. In this case, it was the standard textbook account was in terms of zeros and ones. But of course, the zeros and ones by themselves won't be sufficient for consciousness or intentionality because they are defined purely formally or syntactically. And we know that conscious states and intentionality in general have something more than a syntactical structure. It's got a semantic content. And I argued for that a long time ago, 25 years ago, with what was called the Chinese room argument. You can imagine yourself carrying out the steps in a computer program for some a cognitive capacity you don't have. I don't speak Chinese, for example, and you can imagine that you give correct answers to questions in Chinese just by going through the steps of the program, but all the same you don't understand a word of Chinese because all you've got is the syntax and not the semantics. And now, and this is the bottom line, if I don't understand Chinese on the basis of implementing the Chinese understanding program, then neither does any other digital computer solely on that basis, because the computer, qua computer, hasn't got anything that I don't have. All the computer has is what I've got in the Chinese room, a set of symbols and a set of rules for manipulating them. I'm tempted to tell you about my 25-year adventure with that argument. I mean, I've had some absolutely crazy replies to that argument. One that came up, I can't resist a little bit about this, that kept coming up over and over was, well, suppose you're there in the Chinese room and we ask you, do you understand Chinese? And you give the correct answer. You say, yes, I do understand Chinese. Now, wouldn't that show that you understand Chinese? Well, I'm afraid I don't think that's a very powerful argument, but let's illustrate it. I get a symbol that looks like this. This will be in a dialect of Chinese some of you may not recognize. I get a symbol that looks like that. I don't know what the hell the damn thing means, but I go and look up what I'm supposed to do in the program, and I fumble around in my database, and then I give them back a symbol that looks like this is in the same dialect. And unknown to me, this symbol means, do you understand Chinese? And this symbol means, why do you guys ask me such dumb questions? Can't you see I understand Chinese? Now, that was a kind of simple argument, but most of the other sophisticated arguments weren't much better. Okay. Now, however, there is a more subtle point, and that's this. Not only does the program not carry a semantics, not by definition, but you have to ask yourself, what fact about a system makes it the case that it's running a program? And on the standard definitions, you'd have to distinguish between programs which are psychologically real, as I might add 1 + 1 to get 2, according to, I carry out the addition function, and doing the same thing in a pocket calculator. Now, absolutely fundamental to science is the distinction between those features which are observer independent, like force, mass, gravitational attraction, and tectonic plates, and those that are observer dependent, like money, property, government, marriage, corporations, and universities. Now, which side does the program fall on? Is it in the eye of the beholder, or is it a fact of physics? Now, I want to say that when we're talking about those programs which are not psychologically real, but where we build a piece of machinery, then the program level of description is observer relative. It's relative to our interest. Now, that doesn't mean it's arbitrary. We use these damn programs to fly airplanes. But it does mean that you do not identify a fundamental feature of reality, like the weak and strong nuclear forces, by saying, well, it's in this program state, because that's in the eye of the beholder. That's observer relative. And that point never got the attention that the Chinese room argument got. But I think it is fundamental that we distinguish between those programs running in the brain which have some psychological reality to them, such as, for example, my carrying out addition, and those programs that are entirely as if or observer relative. Let me nail this down to an example. You can describe the vestibular ocular reflex as if it were implementing a program, as if it were carrying out a rule. Does everybody know what the VOR is? I'll demonstrate the VOR. I mean, if you shake your head while you're looking at me, or you move it around like that, you'll find your eyes remain focused on me, and that's because it's a neat reflex. It starts in our old friend, the semicircular canals, and it goes through, that goes over the 8th cranial nerve to the cerebellum, and a lot of things happen in there that I forgot. But in any case, you can describe all that in computational terms, but there's no psychological reality to that. That's not a piece of intrinsic observer-independent cognition. That is just a piece of machinery in the brain that has different levels of description. And if we're going to talk about cognitive computing, it seems to me absolutely fundamental to make this distinction. See, I was struck by the fact that a lot of the speakers yesterday talked as if it were just obvious that what we need to know about the brain is which algorithms. And I think it's nice to know that, but it's also nice to know, and in fact, you don't really understand what's going on with the algorithms until you understand what's going on in the plumbing. Think of the difference between Mars' account of vision and contemporary neurobiological accounts. I think I admire Mars' achievement enormously, but we don't get to science until we know how the actual physical mechanisms by which the assault of the photons on the photoreceptor cells eventually results in a conscious experience, not in a description of an experience, even a 3D description of an experience, but an actual description. Okay, now this distinction between the observer relative and the observer independent sense of a program and algorithm also carries over to information and intelligence. I shudder when people use the notion of information and information processing very casually, because we need to distinguish between those cases of information processing which are real, intrinsic, observer-independent processes. So, for example, I have in my brain a lot of information about how to get to San Jose from Berkeley. I know the way to San Jose. But I got maps in my car that also contain the same information, but it's a different sense of information altogether. That information is observer relative. Now, it's harder to make this distinction when you get inside the brain. But it seems to me absolutely crucial, if we're going to know how the brain works, to distinguish between those information descriptions that describe something that is psychologically real, something that's going on intrinsically in the brain, and those which are observer relative or as if. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think that is a leading problem in our efforts to move cognitive science forward. Is we have to have a much clearer conception of notions like information and intelligence. Again, I don't want to get sidetracked with this, but artificial intelligence was exactly the wrong word for that discipline. Why? Well, artificial is already a pun. It's got two different meanings. An artificial X can mean either a real X produced artificially, or it can mean a fake X. So artificial dyes are real dyes, all right. Most of your rugs are full of artificial dyes. That's a real dye made artificially. It's not made out of plants. But artificial cream is not real cream made from artificial cows. It's not the real thing at all. So which is it with artificial intelligence? And those of you who can see in diagrams will see there are four possibilities here. You can have the real observer-independent intelligence produced artificially, or you can work through the other permutations. But here's the crucial mistake. A lot of people thought, and maybe some people still think, that by producing a simulation artificially of intelligence, we have produced real intelligence artificially, and that doesn't follow. I mean, that takes a separate argument. And so these little puns on the names of these movements seem fairly harmless. Why are we getting sidetracked with this? But I think it's important to get clear conceptually. Okay, now I want to move on. Here we are. We got this great research project. We want to know how the hell does it work in the brain. And as a philosopher, I don't have to go and stab brains in a lab. And that, I have to tell you, is a source of some comfort, because I've been in some of these labs. I don't want to tell you what goes on. Okay. Now, it looks like a standard research program. And the way you do it is first step. You find the correlation, and we're so enthusiastic about this, even got a name nowadays called the NCC. You find the neuronal correlate of consciousness. Secondly, you figure out if it's a causal correlation, and you do that with a standard test. That is to say, if you found what you thought was the NCC for consciousness, and you found that it's always correlated with consciousness, the next step would be, well, can you turn on consciousness in an otherwise unconscious subject by turning on the NCC, and can you turn off consciousness by turning off the NCC? I don't want to be the subject in these experiments, but in any case, that looks like standard scientific practice. Then the third step is you try to get a theory. You try to embed all this in a theory. And if you look at the history of science, look at the development of the germ theory of disease, it went through these steps. First, Semmelweis had to figure out, well, there are these correlations between the way his young doctors treated patients and whether or not the patient lived. They were looking for the NCC. Now, that's what the stage we're still in. And I am optimistic about this. In fact, I think it's the most exciting project in science. But there is, again, a tremendous ambiguity that I have to tell you about, and that is, what is it exactly that we're trying to explain? There are two different approaches to consciousness. One is what I call the unified field approach. You remember I said consciousness always comes to us in a unified field, where we try to figure out, how does the brain do that? How does the brain create a unified field? Now, a much more common approach is what I call the building block approach. Treat your conscious field as made up of various building blocks, like the color red and the taste of the water. And then try and figure out how the brain causes any one building block. And the assumption is, if we could figure out how the brain causes the experience of red, that might be the key to everything. Because presumably the mechanisms by which red is produced will be similar to the mechanisms by which other conscious states are produced. And that is the approach pursued by most investigators, what I call the building block approach. But the problem with that is, and I just remind you of some of these experiments because they're quite beautiful. One I like is where you work on Gestalt switching. And here, in my high-tech fashion, I have actually prepared an extremely high-tech visual aid. I did this just before the talk. That is supposed to be a duck rabbit. It's supposed to be a duck looking to the right or a rabbit looking up toward the sky. Now notice several things. First of all, remarkable property of the human brain. You can see it as either a duck or a rabbit, but it doesn't look the least bit like an actual duck or an actual rabbit. If somebody sold you a rabbit that looked like that, or a duck, you would not eat such a duck. But in any case, the other thing I want you to notice is that your brain does automatically switch from one to another. You can't hold them both simultaneously. You switch from a duck or rabbit, and once you get so you can see both, you will tend automatically to see one or the other. And the idea that some people have is, if we could find the exact point in the brain where you switch from seeing the duck to seeing the rabbit, we would then have the NCC for the rabbit experience. However, you could find the exact point where we switch over, you'd have the NCC for the other percept. And that is a very common, that's one line of research. Now, this has also been pursued systematically with binocular rivalry. If you show a set of vertical lines to one eye and horizontal lines to the other eye, the subject typically does not see a grid. It's winner take all. You either see the horizontal lines or the vertical lines. And once again, people have the impression, if we could find the exact point in the brain where the vertical lines win and the horizontal lines lose, or when it switches back, the horizontal lines win and the vertical lines lose, that would give us the NCC for that experience. There are lots of, another one I'm sure you're familiar with is Larry Weisskranz's work on blindside, where it looks like we have two visual systems in the brain, only one of which is conscious. And if we could find out exactly the distinction, that again looks like it might give us the NCC. Finally, the most common line of research, I think, is just to track a stimulus. And this is what much of the wonderful work that's done on vision does. You track the stimulus from the photoreceptor cells over the optic chiasm through the lateral geniculate nucleus back to V1, and there's a lot of feedback to the LGN, and then through the various other stages until finally you get an experience. You get a conscious experience in the cortex. And it looks like that will be the NCC. Now, I hope these guys succeed, but I'm skeptical, and here's why. All of these experiments are done on subjects who are already conscious. They're already fully conscious. You can't do blindside or binocular rivalry unless the subject is already conscious. And what we need to know is, how does the brain produce that consciousness in the first place? See, the way I like to think of it is this. Think of perception not as causing consciousness, but as modifying a pre-existing conscious field. And I think in very simple metaphors. I mean, think there's a great big field, big grassy field, and then perception produces bumps and hillocks and ravines in the field. If you think that you can't have consciousness without perception, remember that this morning I woke up in a strange room which was completely dark, and I had no perceptual or absolutely minimal perceptual experience, maybe the weight of my body against the bed and the weight of the rug against my body. But with minimal perceptual experiences, I was absolutely, totally alert and awake and thinking, my God, what am I going to tell those people at 9 o'clock? But anyway, that's the kind of thing one thinks about on such occasions. And the point I'm making here is then when I get up and walk around, of course, am I creating consciousness? In a sense, I am, because I am creating conscious experiences that did not exist before I got up and turned on the light and got dressed and had breakfast. But it seems to me the best way to think of that is to think of those as modifications of the conscious field. And what we really are seeking is an explanation of how the brain creates the conscious field. And I don't have to tell you that I think some of the most exciting work is done by various people in this room, prominently Jerry Edelman, but Christoph and so on. There's a lot of very exciting research is going on. Francis Crick once, Francis was a wonderful man, and we're all going to miss him, but he once told me, you know, consciousness, that's a lot harder than DNA. And I burst out laughing because we've been trying to figure out consciousness for a couple thousand years. It's going to be much more difficult than DNA, which is a great achievement, but it's a relative, I mean, it's compared with the discovery of how the brain creates and sustains consciousness, it is a less difficult problem. Okay, now I want to get to some of the special problems about dualism. How much time did I leave myself? Oh boy, I better talk fast. Okay, here we go. How are we going to avoid the problem of dualism if, as I've said, consciousness has subjectivity, qualitativeness, and intentionality? Well, if you look at this list, what you discover is some of these features that Descartes told us are features of consciousness. Namely, it's not spatially located, it's not spatially extended, and it has none of the standard physical properties such as force, mass, gravitational, electrical charge, etc. It seems to be outside the physical world. And this has led a lot of people to epiphenomenalism. And they say, look, if you grant that consciousness exists and that it is truly irreducible, then it seems you're forced to saying that it's epiphenomenal. It cannot affect the physical world. Why? Because the physical world is causally closed. There's no way something could come outside the physical universe and cause my arm to go up. It would have to be something in the physical world, and you've already prevented yourself from allowing for that by saying that consciousness is irreducible, that it has this irreducible subjective ontology. Now, what's the answer to that? Well, my answer is going to be in two parts. First of all, there's no reason why we should accept this traditional Cartesian way of carving up the territory. This is just a residue of the 17th century. And what I want to suggest is subjectivity, qualitativeness, and intentionality can perfectly well be part of a system which is where the system is ontologically objective. That is, what I want to do is move subjectivity, qualitativeness, and intentionality over to the right-hand side and treat them as what they are, ordinary biological phenomena. It's just a brute fact of nature that we have evolved nervous systems that are capable of producing qualitative, subjective, intentional states. But then the question arises, well, how? So what I'm suggesting is get rid of the traditional terminology and its assumptions. Is consciousness physical? Well, it depends on what you mean by physical. But if you mean, is it part of ordinary biological reality caused by neurobiological processes and realized in the brain, then it seems to me there's no question that consciousness is a physical property. But then, since this vocabulary of mental and physical was designed precisely to make an opposition, maybe we should just get rid of the vocabulary and just state the facts. But now then, we got a problem. How can consciousness ever function causally? And it seems to me what I want to do here is turn the traditional conception on its head. The traditional conception, can you read that all right? Yeah. The traditional conception says, look, these have to be separate. They have to be completely distinct phenomena. But I want to say, no, look, we know that at least some conscious events cause physical events, because, as I said, I decide to raise my arm and it goes up. But we also know that anything that causes my arm to go up in that way has got to have certain electrochemical properties. Now, I won't tell you the horrible, all of them, but you got to secrete acetylcholine at the axon end, cellular motor neurons, and eventually it's going to reach the where it comes up against the muscle fibers, and then there's a bit about the ion channels, and they open up, and all kinds of other complex things happen. And we'll just abbreviate them by saying that there are electrochemical properties. But then anything that causes my arm to go up has to have those properties, because if those don't happen, the thing does not go up. But now then, it seems to me, we get a conclusion. Some conscious events have electrochemical properties. But now, any event that has electrochemical properties, I guess we could define as a physical event, so at least some conscious events are physical events. How is that possible? We're just talking about different levels of description. It's no more mysterious than the fact that my car engine has a level of description where we talk about cylinders and pistons and spark plugs, and a level of description where you talk about the oxidization of the hydrocarbon molecules. And people, we have this prejudice that somehow the top level isn't really real. But notice when you go to your mechanic, you say things like, I think the spark plugs aren't any good. The damn thing won't start. You don't say, the passage of electrons is insufficient to sustain the oxidization of the hydrocarbons. Now, that's what's going on, but there is a causally real level where you can describe it at a much higher level. Okay, so the conclusion that I want to draw is then we can accept the facts about consciousness, that it's real, that it functions causally, that it's irreducible, that it's entirely caused by brain processes and realized in the brain. We can accept that without accepting the traditional mistakes of dualism. I said I would conclude by saying what was true in materialism and what I think is wrong, and what's true in dualism and what I think is wrong. Materialists say correctly that the universe is entirely made up of what we sometimes call particles in fields of force. But whatever I wish these guys would get their act together, by the way. But I liked physics better when there was electrons, protons, and neutrons. But anyhow, those days are gone for good. Whatever is the ultimately true, physics says the ultimate particles. That's it. There isn't anything else. And everything is made up of those things. That's what is true in materialism. What's false is to say, well, then consciousness cannot exist. Consciousness has to be excluded by any complete physical science. And what's true in dualism is it says consciousness really does exist. It really is an irreducible, real biological phenomena. But what the dualist says, which is false, is therefore it must be in a separate realm. It must have a different realm of being. It's not part of the real world. The real objection to dualism in the end is it's incoherent. You cannot give a coherent description of the world that shows how we fit in as conscious, mindful, rational beings in a world that is made of physical particles. And what I have been urging is if we mind our P's and Q's, we state the position carefully, then you see how those are perfectly consistent. It's perfectly consistent to grant the facts about consciousness while accepting all the facts about physics. Well, look, I'd love to talk a whole lot more, and I have to apologize for one thing, and that is I cannot stay for the panel discussion this afternoon, so I hope I get a lot of hostile questions now. There's a memorial service I just have to attend in Berkeley. But in any case, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, let's see, I'll start over here and I'll come back there.
Thank you. Robert Heck Nielsen. I'm surprised by your insistence that the brain and consciousness cannot be accommodated in a computer architecture. If you were at my talk yesterday, you saw that these four constructs that I propose as the explanation for the cognitive brain can be simulated on a computer, were simulated, and yielded the kind of qualitative, subjective characteristics that we associate with consciousness in a machine. Furthermore, I think that as this construct is extended further to include the intentionality part, to include the part of actually offering up motor control, to include the emotional component, that we might very well achieve the replacement of the brain tissue with silicon. So maybe that's a position that should be tentative and not so hard.
Yeah. Well, I certainly am open, but let's go through the details. The question I wanted to ask, it was a very impressive presentation you made yesterday, and the question I want to ask is the stuff in that box conscious? Is there something it feels like? It's a zombie. Okay. Now, what I'm interested in is not what are the possibilities of zombies. I think they're probably rather limited, and that's why traditional AI failed. It's the most they could do was produce zombies. The marvelous thing would be to produce a conscious robot. Okay, now, there is, again, we've got other philosophical obstacles we have to overcome. We have a traditional opposition between people and machines, but that's obsolete. I mean, is the brain a machine? Of course. I mean, if the brain, if a machine is any physical system capable of performing certain functions, then the brain is a machine. So there's no obstacle in principle whatever to building an artificial brain that was conscious.
But you're going too far. There's an erosion of your list. You have a list There's an erosion of your list. You have a list of conscious properties.
Yeah.
All right. And my system actually exhibits components of that list, and that's an erosion of your position in my view.
I don't think it does exhibit them, and let me tell you exactly which ones it does not exhibit. On your own account, it does not have subjectivity.
It does.
No, it doesn't have consciousness.
It does. It exhibits subjectivity and qualitative. Microphone.
Okay. As I have defined those, you can't have those without consciousness.
Well, we can argue that separately, but I claim the first two have been achieved, and so your list is eroding. I think your position needs to soften.
Yeah, I don't think the list is eroding because this is the definition of consciousness, these three. Now, the only tough one is the third one, intentionality. And a lot of people, I think, made a serious mistake, and this was why I made the distinction between the real observer-independent intentionality and the observer-relative or as-if intentionality. I ascribe intentionality to my computer and my car and a whole lot of other things, but it's all observer-relative. There's no mental life in the car or the computer. There is in me, there is in my brain, because I have these subjective qualitative experiences. But you see, but I don't see it in your system because you don't have the machinery. I mean, you didn't tell us what the machinery was, but if you had the machinery to produce qualitative subjectivity, then there would be something that it feels like to be your machine. And I didn't get that out of your talk. I wish you'd had more time to tell us the mechanism. But this is the bottom line of this is there's no reason in principle why we cannot build a conscious machine. And by the way, this is why robotics is so disappointing because they don't know how to make a conscious robot. But in order to do that, it's not enough to do a simulation of the brain. You've got to duplicate the causal powers of the brain. Now, you might do that in some completely different material. We ought to hear the question, can you build a conscious machine out of different materials than from those that the brain uses, as we hear the question, can you build a heart that pumps blood out of something other than muscle tissue? We know how the heart does it, so we know how to build an artificial heart. We don't know how the brain does it, so we don't yet know how to build an artificial brain. Yes?
Right here. Suppose that my corpus callosum is cut, and so two my brain hemispheres are no longer exchanging information. Will I wake up, my consciousness wake up, as one of these two hemispheres, or will I continue to be in both hemispheres at once? And if it's one of the two, then which one?
Which one? Right. Are you a lefty or a righty? That's what
I'm a righty.
Okay. You see, one reason we love the split brain experiments, by the way, it's a scandal that they were ever allowed to perform that operation. They're not allowed to do it anymore. But in any case, it did happen, and we can benefit from the information. One of the reasons it's exciting is it looks like a threat to the idea that our consciousness comes to us as part of a single unified field. Because when the corpus callosum is cut, it looks like you got two conscious fields that are communicating with each other only imperfectly. And I asked Gazzaniga point blank, are both halves conscious? I think his answer has to be yes, but he refused to give that answer. He said, I found no experimental way to test that. The reason the answer has to be yes, that both halves are conscious, is that the machinery is pretty much the same. I mean, you got language, more language on the left than you do on the right, but the kind of machinery that's necessary for producing consciousness will be duplicated on the right and the left. So I think both halves have to be conscious. And we don't know what to say about these puzzle cases. I mean, philosophers love this kind of thought experiment. If you put half of your brain in one body and the other half in the other body, which is really you? Now, I don't think there's an answer to that question, but the problem with these questions about identity is we feel, well, all the same, I would know it was really me. The difficulty is that guy over there, he knows it's really me, even though he's not me. So I don't think there's an answer to the question. Yeah.
Yeah. I have an ignorant question. I'm perplexed by why consciousness is interesting, any more so than, let's say, culture as an emergent phenomenon amongst populations of humans. And if I was to reduce the question, it seems we can't tease apart consciousness. We can't do experiments on it. It is massively more complex than things that we do experiments on. And from a computational equivalence point of view, it doesn't seem so mysterious. If you have a phenomenon that is itself incredibly complex, way beyond the capacity of any computer or simulation, it nevertheless isn't a layer of abstraction that is real, that we experience, like you say. And to reconcile this false dichotomy, it seems that if it is computationally complex, beyond anything we can model, and is irreducible, meaning there's no shortcut to predict the behavior of a complex system of that magnitude, then it's much like evolution itself. It's much like the evolution of memes, genes, and what have you, that it's just we're way short in our computationally modeling capacity, and we may never reach it, thereby preserving illusions of free will and the richness of life is the richness of complexity.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure exactly how to answer the question. Did everybody hear it? There are two halves of the question. One is, why should we make a big deal out of consciousness? But secondly, even if we think it is a big deal, all the same we may not be able to solve it because it's so complex. Is that a fair summary of the question?
And does that explain perhaps why we have these two ways of looking at things?
Okay, well, about the first one, I think consciousness is not only important, it is the condition of possibility of anything at all being important. Remember, something is important to you only insofar as you are conscious. No consciousness, no meaning, no importance. Imagine that you had exactly your life, only you're a total zombie. There was never a light inside your brain. Then you might as well be dead. So I think consciousness is not only important, it is, so to speak, the most important thing, because all other important things depend on consciousness for their importance. Now, the other point about computational complexity, one of the subtexts of my
But just, to be fair, life... heat,
culture,
a lot of things.
But those go with consciousness. Of course, I can't be conscious if I'm dead. But granted that I'm alive, and not all living things are conscious, but some of them are, and I'm one of them. Excuse me. I'm not only conscious, but I'm losing my voice. Granted that there are lots of other essential conditions for a meaningful life. You can have all those conditions, but without consciousness, you don't have a meaningful life. Consciousness is the condition of the possibility. But now the second question, I think, presupposes something that I have not sufficiently challenged or did not articulate my challenge, and that is, we should not take it for granted that the problem of consciousness is an algorithmic computational problem. There are some parts of consciousness that are computationally complex, but there are a lot of parts that are ludicrously simple. I mean, when Deep Blue beat Kasparov, all the newspapers called me up, wasn't this a blow to human dignity? I hauled out my pocket calculator and I said, I have a pocket calculator that can out-arithmetic any mathematician that ever lived. Is this a blow to human dignity? No, it's a credit to the IBM programmers in the case of Deep Blue. So a lot of things I think are not as complex as we suppose, but it's not complexity that is our issue. What is at issue is the capacity of the brain to cause and sustain these qualitative, subjective states of sentience or awareness, and that's our life. That is what the way we plan things, the way we do things. And it may turn out that the explanation is incredibly complicated, but it may turn out that it's a simple principle. We don't know. I mean, if you look at the phylogenetic facts of the world, how can all of this enormous variety be explained by simple principles? Well, it can be. That is, a DNA and RNA, of course, you got RNA, will explain the facts of heredity. You got a long story to tell about how you get from the genotype to the phenotype, but the underlying principles are not at all complicated. And I don't know how it's going to turn out with consciousness, but we can't assume in advance that it's going to be impossibly complicated. Yeah.
First, I just wanted to say that I taught a class on consciousness just recently that was joined in a computer science and the brain program. And part of that, I also taught your work, but you did it much better than me. Then I had actually two questions, which are maybe related. One is about the point of intentionality. So I'm afraid I do not fully understand what you mean, because I do not see how every state of consciousness will have intentionality. So I think I don't understand your definition of that. And then the second one, if IBM managed to make now a conscious machine after this meeting, how will we know that the machine is conscious?
Right. Okay, those are two very good questions. The first question was, why do I say that all conscious states have intentionality? And the answer is I don't say that. I tried to cover too much, and I left out a lot of qualifications. Not all consciousness is intentional. So you can have undirected feelings of anxiety where you're just kind of nervous, and you're not nervous about anything. You don't know what you're nervous about, but you just feel anxious, and that's not intentional. That's not about anything. I once lectured on intentionality to an audience of a Freudian psychoanalysts, and I told them about that, and they said, that's our job. Our job is to convert the undirected anxiety into directed anxiety. And it reminded me of Freud's famous claim that the aim of psychoanalysis is to replace neurotic misery with ordinary human unhappiness. And I guess ordinary human unhappiness has directed intentionality. So that was just my fault. I didn't explain this very clearly. Now, what was the second question?
How would you know?
Oh, yeah, how would we know? How would we know? Yes. Okay, now here's the problem we have. It's not, in real life, it's not such a big deal, but philosophers make a lot out of it, and that's this. The best way to know whether a system is conscious is to be that system. I don't have any doubts about that system. But I have a problem there, and that is there's only one exemplar of my consciousness, and that's me. So it looks like I got this terrible problem about, well, how do I know they're not all zombies out there, carefully programmed by IBM programmers to pretend to be listening to my lecture and so on. And the answer is, of course, I do know. Now let me tell you how I know, and I want to give you a small experimental lab that I have at home. My dog Gilbert. When I come home, my dog Gilbert comes rushing out, wagging his tail, jumping all over me, and trying to lick my hand and so on. Now, I'm absolutely certain that Gilbert is conscious. Again, there's always some philosopher, going back to Descartes, who will tell you animals are not conscious. I wish they'd meet Gilbert. But in any case, just crazy to say Gilbert is not conscious. How do I know? Well, the standard answer is, well, you know from his behavior. He behaves like a conscious human being. I think that's wrong. The people I know don't try to lick my hand and wag their tails. It's just not right. The way that I'm absolutely confident that Gilbert is conscious is that I can see that the causal mechanisms are relevantly like mine, and they coordinate with input, stimuli, and output behavior in a way that's relevantly like mine. It isn't just that he wags his tail just like a human. That's not it at all. Rather, it's that I can see those are his eyes, these are his ears, this is his skin. And that's why I'm absolutely confident about Gilbert, but I don't know about, let's say, termites. Your typical termite's only got 100,000 neurons, and maybe that's not enough to get in a ball game. I lose that every big weekend. So I don't know how many neurons it takes. So I leave that to experts as to how far down the phylogenetic scale consciousness goes. But for animals and higher animals like the primates and animals like dogs and cats, there isn't any question that they're conscious. And the reason we're absolutely confident of that is we have a confidence in we operate on the principle that relevantly similar causes produce relevantly similar effects. Okay, now how about building a machine? How would we know when it's conscious? Well, it's not enough to just program it so that when we ask it, are you conscious, it says, yeah, sure thing, and how, and emits other affirmative allomorphs. We can do that today. That's not the problem. We have to know on what principles does the machine operate, and how are they relevantly similar and different from this machine. Now, again, philosophers like thought experiments, and here's one I like to imagine. Imagine that my vision starts to decay, And the desperate doctors, unable to cure my vision, immediately get on the phone to Dr. Berger, and he starts plugging in silicon chips. I don't have to wear them on the outside. That's no fun. I want to wear them on the inside. So he pushed them on the inside. And one possibility is we can imagine my vision is restored. Then we would discover that this is why I asked the question yesterday, the crucial question. What is the functional element? And he said electrical current. Now, if the electrical current was sufficient, then my vision would be restored. All right, but now let's suppose vision continues to decay and they continue to plug in more silicon chips. And if you've ever had a philosophy course, you know where this ends up. In the end, my brain is all silicon chips. I can shake my head and feel them rattling around inside. Now, there are at least three possibilities. One possibility is I might have full consciousness. I think this is science fiction, but that's a possibility we can't rule out, that you could duplicate and not merely simulate brain processes by duplicating electrical circuitry in a different type of non-organic medium. I think that's not going to happen, but that's at least one possibility. Another possibility, depressing, is that my behavior might be preserved by the silicon chips, but my consciousness might shrink to zero. I would be a total zombie. I could feel my consciousness shrinking when they put these questions to me. What color is this, they say, and I hear my voice saying, it is red. And I want to shout out, I can't see a damn thing, I'm blind in here, but I hear the silicon chips producing these noises. Now, that's another possibility. A third possibility would be that my consciousness is fully restored, but my behavior shrinks to zero. And that's a scary thought also, because I can hear them saying, we might as well pull the plug. The guy's obviously brain dead. And this last, alas, is not just a thought experiment. This actually happens in the Guillain-Barré syndrome. There are patients who have the Guillain-Barré syndrome, and they report a very scary experience. Namely, they were totally paralyzed. They couldn't move a muscle, and people thought they must be dead, but somehow or other they came back and they reported this experiment. So those are three possibilities of how you could relate a non-organic inner consciousness-producing structure with a behavior and with the production of consciousness. My guess is that it's likely to be more dependent on the specific electrochemistry of the brain than something we can easily duplicate and not merely simulate in silicon. And remember always, simulation is not duplication. You have not duplicated just because you do a simulation. How are we doing?
We're going to take one last question from this gentleman.
I can easily accept that consciousness is not an illusion, but when you look at the different qualities of consciousness, some of those could be an illusion. So the causality, for example, I think it's very difficult to defend that position, and I think Spinoza was saying that if a falling stone had consciousness, it would say that it's falling out of its own free will. And the question is, couldn't it be that we are just making up a story in our mind? We're confabulating. So the hand went up, and then in retrospect, we build the story. Yeah, it's because we know there are patients actually with conditions. For example, the patient that doesn't have short-term memory, and you ask him questions and he makes up a story of why he did things that we know definitely aren't true. There were experiments by Ben Libet several years ago that actually tried to time when we are conscious of things and when actually activity of neurons occur in the brain. And his claim was that there is a gap of about half a second between the two. So how would you relate to these?
No, I'm very grateful for all these questions, and this one is just terrific. Part of consciousness I didn't talk about was the experience of free action. And there's no question that we have that experience. You make up your mind in the restaurant what you're going to order. And you sense different possibilities open. You sense a gap between the previous causes and your subsequent decision and your subsequent action. And that gap has a name. It's called the freedom of the will. Now, the point you're making is it might turn out to be an illusion. It might turn out that though we have the experience of free will, it's strictly illusory. Everything we do is completely determined. And we have a certain amount of experimental evidence that suggests that some of the actions people perform, which they think they perform of their own free will, are not indeed of their own free will. Couldn't it all be like that? The problem of free will, though, is this. If it's an illusion, it's an illusion we can't give up. You're in a restaurant, and you're at the dinner yesterday, and they say, do you want the vegetarian dinner, or do you want the beef and salmon? Now, you can't say to the waitress, look, I'm a determinist, I'll just wait and see what I order, or I'll wait and see what happens. You can't do that. Now, why not? Kant pointed this out. The refusal to exercise your own free will is intelligible to you only as an exercise of your own free will. That is, it only makes sense to you to say, I'll choose the salmon, I'll choose the vegetarian, I won't choose anything because I'm a determinist. All of those possibilities only make sense as an exercise of your own free will. I gave a lecture on this once in London, and a guy got up in the audience and said, if determinism were shown to be true, would you accept it? And I pointed out the logical form of the question is, if it were demonstrated that there is no such thing as free, rational action, would you freely, rationally act so as to accept it? This is an odd case. And you see, I can give up other illusions. And on bad days, I think, well, maybe colors are just an illusion. You know, it's really just light reflectances, and sunsets aren't really sunsetting, and rainbows aren't really arches in the sky. But in that way, we can't give up on free will. Okay, I mean, but that doesn't mean it's true. It just means we're condemned. We're stuck with this presupposition. Okay, but now a lot of these experiments that you mentioned are overrated. Let's take Ben Libet's. Now, to begin with, those experiments were conducted by Deka and Kornhuber in 1970s in Germany. They used to send me their stuff. And Libet did invented a wonderful device. He had this big clock that goes round and round, and the subject can say exactly where the clock was when the subject decided to push the button or whatever it is. I don't know if everybody knows this stuff, but let me just in 1 second tell you about it. You tell the subject you're going to perform some simple motor action such as push a button. Do it whenever you feel like it, and watch where the clock is when you suddenly became aware that you were going to do it. And what you find is there's an activity in the supplementary motor area that's about 300 milliseconds prior to the guy being aware that he has made the decision to push the button. What follows? Does it follow? Well, that's where free will is an illusion. It's all determined in the supplementary motor area. Well, I think that's a bit swift. Notice two things about this. First of all, even the activity in the supplementary motor area doesn't set causally sufficient conditions. You can veto it. You can always say no and not do it. And Libet says, okay, so maybe we don't have free will, we'll have free won't. Because you can always say, I won't. That I thought I was going to do. But there's another thing that's equally important here is these only work in cases where the subject has already freely made a decision to do this type of action. These are cases. Nobody says when Winston Churchill decided to fight on, that was decided in the supplementary motor area 300 milliseconds before he thought he'd made up his mind. I mean, it's just not that kind of decision. So these are a relatively simple motor tasks, and you have to make a prior intention. So I don't think this settles the problem of free will, those sorts of experiments. And the same with the confabulation experiments. Those are fascinating, but we understand them precisely by contrasting them with standard cases. However, I don't have a solution to the problem of free will. I don't know what the answer is, but I know one thing. We're stuck with it. We're stuck with the presupposition.
Okay, I think we could go on asking questions of Dr. Sёrla all day, but I think we'd like a short break now. So I'd like to thank Dr. Sёrla. You could please be back by 10:30. Thank you.